Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Another World Audiobooks. We are continuing on with the Sherlock saga, A Study in Scarlet. The plot thickens here. We kind of get into a dead body or two, and it's good stuff. Again, did just want to mention, if you're interested in helping out with the podcast, I am looking for somebody to help me with editing the audio. I love doing this narration part, but if somebody else loves doing editing, I would love to chat with you. You can hit me up at anotherworldaudiobooks@gmail.com. Just shoot me an email over there, and I'd love to chat with you. If editing isn't your thing, but you'd like to see more stuff coming from Another World Audiobooks, remember, you can go to patreon.com/anotherworldaudiobooks and support the podcast there. Every little bit that you contribute to the podcast is going to go toward me being able to hire somebody, if nobody volunteers, to edit the podcast so that we can get more material out there and you guys can enjoy more awesome free audiobooks, because that's what it's all about. And remember, another great way to help the podcast, just leave a review. If you like what you're hearing, just send some love that way. Really appreciate it. With that, without further ado, I give you A Study in Scarlet. Chapter 3. The Lauriston Garden Mystery. I confess that I was considerably startled by this fresh proof of the practical nature of my companion's theories. My respect for his powers of analysis increased wondrously. There still remained some lurking suspicion in my mind, however, that the whole thing was a prearranged episode intended to dazzle me, though what earthly object he could have in taking me in was past my comprehension. When I looked at him, he had finished reading the note, and his eyes had assumed the vacant, lackluster expression which showed mental abstraction. "How in the world did you deduce that?" I asked. "Deduce what?" he said petulantly. "Why, that he was a retired sergeant of Marines." "I have no time for trifles," he answered brusquely, then with a smile. "Excuse my rudeness. You broke the thread of my thoughts, but perhaps it is as well. So, you were actually not able to see that that man was a sergeant of Marines?" "No, indeed." "It was easier to know it than to explain why I knew it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you were quite sure of the fact. Even across the street, I could see a great blue anchor tattooed on the back of the fellow's hand, that smacked of the sea. He had a military carriage, however, and regulation side whiskers. There we have the Marine. He was a man with some amount of self-importance and a certain air of command. You must have observed the way in which he held his head and swung his cane. A steady, respectable, middle-aged man, too, on the face of him. All facts which led me to believe that he had been a sergeant." "Wonderful!" I ejaculated. "Commonplace," said Holmes, though I thought from his expression that he was pleased at my evident surprise and admiration. "I said just now that there were no criminals. It appears that I am wrong. Look at this." He threw me over the note which the commissionaire had brought. "Why," I cried as I cast my eye over it, "this is terrible." "It does seem to be a little out of the common," he remarked calmly. "Would you mind reading it to me aloud?" This is the letter which I read to him. "My dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, there has been a bad business during the night at 3 Lauriston Gardens off the Brixton Road. Our man on the beat saw a light there about 2 in the morning, and as the house was an empty one, suspected that something was amiss. He found the door open, and in the front room, which is bare of furniture, discovered the body of a gentleman, well dressed, and having cards in his pocket, bearing the name of Enoch J. Drebber, Cleveland, Ohio, USA. There had been no robbery, nor is there any evidence as to how the man met his death. There are marks of blood in the room, but there is no wound upon his person. We are at a loss as to how he came into the empty house. Indeed, the whole affair is a puzzler. If you can come round to the house any time before 12, you will find me there. I have left everything in status quo until I hear from you. If you are unable to come, I shall give you fuller details, and would esteem it a great kindness if you would favour me with your opinion. Yours faithfully, Tobias Gregson." "Gregson is the smartest of the Scotland Yarders," my friend remarked. "He and Lestrade are the pick of a bad lot. They are both quick and energetic, but conventional, shockingly so. They have their knives into one another, too. They are as jealous as a pair of professional beauties. There will be some fun over this case if they are both put upon the scent." I was amazed at the calm way in which he rippled on. "Surely there is not a moment to be lost," I cried. "Shall I go and order you a cab?" "I'm not sure about whether I shall go. I am the most incurably lazy devil that ever stood in shoe leather. That is, when the fit is on me, for I can be spry enough at times." "Why, it is just the chances you have been longing for." "My dear fellow, what does it matter to me? Supposing I unravel the whole matter, you may be sure that Gregson, Lestrade and Co. will pocket all the credit that comes of being an unofficial personage." "But he begs you to help him." "Yes, he knows that I am his superior, and acknowledges it to me, but he would cut his own tongue out before he would own it to any third person. However, we may be as well to go and have a look. I shall work it out on my own hook. I may have a laugh at them if I have nothing else. Come on." He hustled on his overcoat, and bustled about in a way that showed that an energetic fit had superseded the apathetic one. "Get your hat," he said. "You wish me to come?" "Yes, if you have nothing better to do." A minute later, we were both in a hansom, driving furiously for the Brixton Road. It was a foggy, cloudy morning, and a dun-coloured veil hung over the housetops, looking like the reflection of the mud-coloured streets beneath. My companion was in the best of spirits, and prattled away about the Cremona fiddles and the difference between Stradivarius and an Amati. As for myself, I was silent, for the dull weather and the melancholy business upon which we were engaged depressed my spirits. "You don't seem to give much thought to the matter in hand," I said at last, interrupting Holmes's musical disquisition. "No data yet," he answered. "It is a capital mistake to theorize before you have all the evidence. It biases the judgment." "You will have your data soon," I remarked, pointing with my finger. "This is the Brixton Road, and that is the house, if I'm not very much mistaken." "So it is. Stop, driver, stop." We were still 100 yards or so from it, but he insisted upon our alighting, and we finished our journey upon foot. Number 3, Lauriston Gardens, wore an ill-omened and minatory look. It was one of 4 which stood back some little way from the street, 2 being occupied and 2 empty. The latter looked out with 3 tiers of vacant, melancholy windows, which were blank and dreary, save that here and there a to-let card had developed like a cataract upon the bleared panes. A small garden sprinkled over with a scattered eruption of sickly plants separated each of these houses from the street, and was traversed by a narrow pathway, yellowish in colour, and consisting apparently of a mixture of clay and of gravel. The whole place was very sloppy from the rain which had fallen through the night. The garden was bounded by a 3-foot brick wall, with a fringe of wood rails upon the top, and against this wall was leaning a stalwart police constable, surrounded by a small knot of loafers, who craned their necks and strained their eyes in the vain hope of catching some glimpse of the proceedings within. I had imagined that Sherlock Holmes would at once have hurried into the house and plunged into a study of the mystery. Nothing appeared to be further from his intention. With an air of nonchalance which, under the circumstances, seemed to me to border upon affectation, he lounged up and down the pavement, and gazed vacantly at the ground, the sky, the opposite houses, and the line of railings. Having finished his scrutiny, he proceeded slowly down the path, or rather down the fringes of grass which flanked the path, keeping his eyes riveted upon the ground. Twice he stopped, and once I saw him smile, and heard him utter an exclamation of satisfaction. There were many marks of footsteps upon the wet clayey soil, but since the police had been coming and going over it, I was unable to see how my companion could hope to learn anything from it. Still, I had had such extraordinary evidence of the quickness of his perceptive faculties, that I had no doubt that he could see a great deal which was hidden from me. At the door of the house we were met by a tall, white-faced, flaxen-haired man, with a notebook in his hand, who rushed forward and wrung my companion's hand with effusion. "It is indeed kind of you to come," he said. "I've had everything left untouched." "Except that," my friend answered, pointing at the pathway. "If a herd of buffaloes had passed along, there could not have been a greater mess. No doubt, however, you had drawn your own conclusions, Gregson, before you permitted this?" "I've had so much to do inside the house," the detective said evasively. "My colleague, Mr. Lestrade, is here. I had relied upon him to look after this." Holmes glanced at me and raised his eyebrows sardonically. "With 2 such men as yourself and Lestrade upon the ground, there will not be much for a third party to find out," he said. Gregson rubbed his hands in a self-satisfied way. "I think we have done all that can be done," he answered. "It's a queer case, though, and I knew your taste for such things." "You did not come here in a cab?" asked Sherlock Holmes. "No, sir." "Nor Lestrade?" "No, sir." "Then let us go and look at the room." With which inconsequent remark he strode on into the house, followed by Gregson, whose features expressed his astonishment. A short passage, bare-planked and dusty, led to the kitchen and offices. 2 doors opened out of it to the left and to the right. One of these had obviously been closed for many weeks. The others belonged to the dining room, which was the apartment in which the mysterious affair had occurred. Holmes walked in, and I followed him with that subdued feeling at my heart which the presence of death inspires. It was a large square room, looking all the larger for the absence of all furniture. A vulgar, flaring paper adorned the walls, but it was blotched in places with mildew, and here and there great strips had become detached and hung down, exposing the yellow plaster beneath. Opposite the door was a showy fireplace, surmounted by a mantelpiece of imitation white marble. On one corner of this was stuck the stump of a red wax candle. The solitary window was so dirty that the light was hazy and uncertain, giving a dull grey tinge to everything, which was intensified by the thick layer of dust which coated the whole apartment. All these details I observed afterwards. At present my attention was centred upon the single, grim, motionless figure which lay stretched upon the boards, with vacant, sightless eyes staring up at the discoloured ceiling. It was that of a man about 43 or 44 years of age, middle-sized, broad-shouldered, with crisp, curling black hair and a short, stubbly beard. He was dressed in a heavy broadcloth frock coat and waistcoat, with light-coloured trousers and immaculate collar and cuffs. A top hat, well brushed and trim, was placed upon the floor beside him. His hands were clenched, and his arms thrown abroad, while his lower limbs were interlocked as though his death struggle had been a grievous one. On his rigid face there stood an expression of horror, and, as it seemed to me, of hatred, such as I have never seen upon human features. This malignant and terrible contortion, combined with a low forehead, blunt nose, and prognathous jaw, gave the dead man a singularly simious and ape-like appearance, which was increased by his writhing, unnatural posture. I have seen death in many forms, but never has it appeared to me in a more fearsome aspect than in that dark, grimy apartment, which looked out upon one of the main arteries of suburban London. Lestrade, lean and ferret-like as ever, was standing by the doorway and greeted my companion and myself. "This case will make a stir, sir," he remarked. "It beats anything I have seen, and I am no chicken." "There is no clue," said Gregson. "None at all," chimed in Lestrade. Sherlock Holmes approached the body, and, kneeling down, examined it intently. "You are sure there is no wound?" he asked, pointing to numerous gouts and splashes of blood which lay all round. "Positive!" cried both detectives. "Then, of course, this blood belongs to a second individual, presumably the murderer, if murder has been committed. It reminds me of the circumstances attendant on the death of Van Jansen in Utrecht in the year 34. Do you remember the case, Gregson?" "No, sir." "Read it up. You really should. There is nothing new under the sun. It has all been done before." As he spoke, his nimble fingers were flying here, there, and everywhere, feeling, pressing, unbuttoning, examining, while his eyes wore the same faraway expression which I had already remarked upon. So swiftly was the examination made, that one would hardly have guessed the minuteness with which it was conducted. Finally, he sniffed the dead man's lips, and then glanced at the soles of his patent leather boots. "He has not been moved at all?" he asked. "No more than was necessary for the purpose of our examination." "You can take him to the mortuary now," he said. "There is nothing more to be learned." Gregson had a stretcher and 4 men at hand. At his call they entered the room, and the stranger was lifted and carried out. As they raised him, a ring tinkled down and rolled across the floor. Lestrade grabbed it up and stared at it with mystified eyes. "There has been a woman here," he cried. "It's a woman's wedding ring." He held it out as he spoke, upon the palm of his hand. We all gathered round him and gazed at it. There could be no doubt that the circlet of plain gold had once adorned the finger of a bride. "This complicates matters," said Gregson. "Heaven knows, they were complicated enough before." "You're sure it doesn't simplify them?" observed Holmes. "There's nothing to be learned by staring at it. What did you find in his pockets?" "We have it all here," said Gregson, pointing to a litter of objects upon one of the bottom steps of the stairs. A gold watch, number 97163 by Barrard of London. Gold Albert chain, very heavy and solid. Gold ring with Masonic device. Gold pin, bulldog's head, with rubies as eyes. Russian leather card case, with cards of Enoch J. Drebber of Cleveland, corresponding with the EJD upon the linen. No purse, but loose money to the extent of £7.13. Pocket edition of Boccaccio's Decameron, with the name of Joseph Stangerson upon the flyleaf. 2 letters, one addressed to E.J. Drebber, and one to Joseph Stangerson. At what address? American Exchange, Strand, to be left to called for. They were both from the Goyne Steamship Company, and referred to the sailing of their boats from Liverpool. It is clear that this unfortunate man was about to return to New York. Have you made any inquiries as to this man Stangerson? I did at once, sir, said Gregson. I've had advertisements sent to all the newspapers, and one of my men has gone to the American Exchange, but he has not returned yet. Have you sent to Cleveland? We telegraphed this morning. How did you word your inquiries? We simply detailed the circumstances, and said we should be glad of any information which could help us. You did not ask for particulars on any point which appeared to you to be crucial. I asked about Stangerson. Nothing else. Is there no circumstance on which this whole case appears to hinge? Will you not telegraph again? I've said all I have to say, said Gregson in an offended voice. Sherlock Holmes chuckled to himself, and appeared to be about to make some remark, when Lestrade, who had been in the front room while we were holding this conversation in the hall, reappeared upon the scene, rubbing his hands in a pompous and self-satisfied manner. Mr. Gregson, he said, I have just made a discovery of the highest importance, and one which would have been overlooked had I not made a careful examination of the walls. The little man's eyes sparkled as he spoke, and he was evidently in a state of suppressed exultation at having scored a point against his colleague. Come here, he said, bustling back into the room, the atmosphere of which felt cleaner since the removal of its ghastly inmate. Now, stand here. He struck a match on his boot and held it up against the wall. Look at that, he said triumphantly. I had remarked that the paper had fallen away in parts. In this particular corner of the room, a large piece had peeled off, leaving a yellow square of coarse plastering. Across this bare space there was scrawled in blood-red letters a single word. R-A-C-H-E. What do you think of that? Cried the detective, with the air of a showman exhibiting his show. This was overlooked, because it was in the darkest corner of the room, and no one thought of looking there. The murderer has written it with his or her own blood. See the smear where it has trickled down the wall? That disposes of the idea of suicide anyhow. Why was that corner chosen to write it on? I will tell you. See that candle on the mantelpiece? It was lit at the time, and if it was lit, this corner would be the brightest instead of the darkest portion of the wall. And what does it mean now that you have found it? Asked Gregson in a depreciatory voice. Mean? Why, it means that the writer was going to put the female name Rachel, but was disturbed before he or she had time to finish. You mark my words, when this case comes to be cleared up, you will find that a woman named Rachel has something to do with it. It's all very well for you to laugh, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. You may be very smart and clever, but the old hound is the best, when all is said and done. I really beg your pardon, said my companion, who had ruffled the little man's temper by bursting into an explosion of laughter. You certainly have the credit of being the first of us to find this out, and, as you say, it bears every mark of having been written by the other participant in last night's mystery. I have not had time to examine this room yet, but, with your permission, I shall do so now. As he spoke, he whipped a tape measure and a large round magnifying glass from his pocket. With these two implements, he trotted noiselessly about the room, sometimes stopping, occasionally kneeling, and once lying flat upon his face. So engrossed was he with his occupation that he appeared to have forgotten our presence, for he chatted away to himself under his breath the whole time, keeping up a running fire of exclamations, groans, whistles, and little cries suggestive of encouragement and of hope. As I watched him, I was irresistibly reminded of a pure-blooded, well-trained foxhound, as it dashes backwards and forwards through the covert, whining in its eagerness until it comes across the lost scent. For 20 minutes or more he continued his researches, measuring with the most exact care the distance between marks which were entirely invisible to me, and occasionally applying his tape to the walls in an equally incomprehensible manner. In one place he gathered up very carefully a little pile of grey dust from the floor, and packed it away in an envelope. Finally, he examined with his glass the word upon the wall, going over every letter of it with the most minute exactness. This done, he appeared to be satisfied, for he replaced his tape and his glass in his pocket. "They say that genius is an infinite capacity for taking pains," he remarked with a smile. "It is a very bad definition, but it does apply to detective work." Gregson and Lestrade had watched the manoeuvres of their amateur companion with considerable curiosity and some contempt. They evidently failed to appreciate the fact, which I had begun to realize, that Sherlock Holmes's smallest actions were all directed towards some definite and practical end. "What do you think of it, sir?" they both asked. "It would be robbing you of the credit of the case if I was to presume to help you," remarked my friend. "You are doing so well now that it would be a pity for anyone to interfere." There was a world of sarcasm in his voice as he spoke. "If you will let me know how your investigation goes," he continued, "I shall be happy to give you any help I can. In the meantime, I should like to speak to the constable who found the body. Can you give me his name and address?" Lestrade glanced at his notebook. "John Rance," he said. "He's off duty now. You will find him at 46 Audley Court, Kennington Park Gate." Holmes took a note of the address. "Come along, Doctor," he said. "We shall go and look him up. I'll tell you one thing which may help you in the case," he continued, turning to the two detectives. "There has been a murder done, and the murderer was a man. He was more than 6 feet high, was in the prime of life, had small feet for his height, wore coarse, square-toed boots, and smoked a Trichinopoly cigar. He came here with his victim in a four-wheeled cab, which was drawn by a horse with 3 old shoes and 1 new one on his off-fore leg. In all probability, the murderer had a florid face, and the fingernails of his right hand were remarkably long. These are only a few indications, but they may assist you." Lestrade and Gregson glanced at each other with an incredulous smile. "If this man was murdered, how was it done?" asked the former. "Poison," said Sherlock Holmes curtly, and strode off. "One other thing, Lestrade," he added, turning round at the door. "RACHE is the German for revenge, so don't lose your time looking for Miss Rachel." With which Parthian shot he walked away, leaving the two rivals open-mouthed behind him. Chapter 4. What John Rance Had to Tell. It was 1 o'clock when we left number 3 Lauriston Gardens. Sherlock Holmes led me to the nearest telegraph office, whence he dispatched a long telegram. He then hailed a cab, and ordered the driver to take us to the address given by Lestrade. "There is nothing like first-hand evidence," he remarked. "As a matter of fact, my mind is entirely made up upon the case, but still, we may as well learn all that is to be learned." "You amaze me, Holmes," said I. "Surely you are not as sure as you pretend to be on all those particulars which you gave." "There is no room for a mistake," he answered. "The very first thing which I observed on arriving there was that a cab had made 2 ruts with its wheels close to the curb. Now, up to last night, we have had no rain for a week, so that those wheels which left such a deep impression must have been there during the night. There were the marks of the horse's hoofs, too, the outline of one of which was far more clearly cut than the other 3, showing that that was a new shoe. Since the cab was there after the rain began, and was not there at any time during the morning, I have Gregson's word for that. It follows that it must have been there during the night, and therefore that it brought those 2 individuals to the house." "That seems simple enough," said I. "But how about the other man's height?" "Why, the height of the man, in 9 cases out of 10, can be told from the length of his stride. It is a simple calculation enough, though there is no use my boring you with figures. I had this fellow's stride both on the clay outside and on the dust within. Then I had a way of checking my calculation. When a man writes on a wall, his instinct leads him to write about the level of his own eyes. Now, that writing was just over 6 feet from the ground. It was child's play." "And his age?" I asked. Well, if a man can stride 4.5 feet without the smallest effort, he can't be quite in the sere and yellow. That was the breadth of a puddle on the garden walk, which he had evidently walked across. Patent leather boots had gone round, and square toes had hopped over. There is no mystery about it at all. I am simply applying to ordinary life a few of those precepts of observation and deduction which I advocated in that article. Is there anything else that puzzles you? The fingernails in the trichinopoly? I suggested. The writing on the wall was done with the man's forefinger dipped in blood. My glass allowed me to observe that the plaster was slightly scratched in doing it, which would not have been the case if the man's nails had been trimmed. I gathered up some scattered ash from the floor. It was dark in colour and flaky, such an ash as is only made by a trichinopoly. I have made a special study of cigar ashes. In fact, I have written a monograph upon the subject. I flatter myself that I can distinguish at a glance the ash of any known brand either of cigar or of tobacco. It is just in such details that the skilled detective differs from the Gregson and Lestrade type. "And the florid face?" I asked. That was a more daring shot, though I have no doubt that I was right. You must not ask me that at the present state of the affair. I passed my hand over my brow. "My head is in a whirl," I remarked. "The more one thinks of it, the more mysterious it grows. How came these two men, if there were two men, into an empty house? What has become of the cabman who drove them? How could one man compel another to take poison? Where did the blood come from? What was the object of the murderer, since robbery had no part in it? How came the woman's ring there? Above all, why should the second man write up the German word Reich before decamping? I confess that I cannot see any possible way of reconciling all these facts." My companion smiled approvingly. "You sum up the difficulties of the situation succinctly and well," he said. "There is much that is still obscure, though I have quite made up my mind on the main facts. As to poor Lestrade's discovery, it was simply a blind intended to put the police upon a wrong track. By suggesting socialism and secret societies, it was not done by a German. The A, if you noticed, was printed somewhat after the German fashion. Now, a real German invariably prints in the Latin characters, so that we may safely say that this was not written by one, but by a clumsy imitator who overdid his part. It was simply a ruse to divert inquiry into a wrong channel. I'm not going to tell you much more of the case, Doctor. You know, a conjurer gets no credit when once he has explained his trick, and if I show you too much my method of working, you will come to the conclusion that I'm a very ordinary individual after all." "I shall never do that," I answered. "You have brought detection as near an exact science as it will ever be brought in this world." My companion flushed up with pleasure at my words, and the earnest way in which I uttered them. I had already observed that he was as sensitive to flattery on the score of his art as any girl could be of her beauty. "I'll tell you one other thing," he said. Patent leathers and square toes came in the same cab, and they walked down the pathway together as friendly as possible, arm in arm in all probability. When they got inside, they walked up and down the room, or rather, Patent leathers stood while square toes walked up and down. I could read all that in the dust, and I could read that as he walked he grew more and more excited. That is shown by the increased length of his strides. He was talking all the while, and working himself up, no doubt, into a fury. Then the tragedy occurred. I have told you all I know myself now, for the rest is mere surmise and conjecture. We have a good working basis, however, on which to start. We must hurry up, for I want to go to Hall's concert to hear Norman Neruda this afternoon." This conversation had occurred while our cab had been threading its way through a long succession of dingy streets and dreary byways. In the dingiest and dreariest of them, our driver suddenly came to a stand. "Well, that's all they caught in there," he said, pointing to a narrow slit in the line of dead-coloured brick. "You'll find me here when you come back." Audley Court was not an attractive locality. The narrow passage led us into a quadrangle paved with flags and lined with sordid dwellings. We picked our way among groups of dirty children and through lines of discoloured linen until we came to number 46, the door of which was decorated with a small slip of brass on which the name Rance was engraved. On inquiry, we found that the constable was in bed, and we were shown into a little front parlour to await his coming. He appeared presently, looking a little irritable at being disturbed in his slumbers. "I made my report at the office," he said. Holmes took half a sovereign from his pocket and played with it pensively. "We thought that we should like to hear it all from your own lips," he said. "I should be most happy to tell you anything I can," the constable answered with his eyes upon the little golden disc. "Just let us hear it all in your own way as it occurred." Rance sat down on his horsehair sofa and knitted his brows as though determined not to omit anything in his narrative. "I'll tell it ye from the beginning," he said. "My time is from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. At 11 there was a fight at the White Hart, but by that I was quiet enough on the beat. At 1 o'clock it began to rain, and I met Harry Murcher, him who has the Holland Grove beat, and we stood together at the corner of Henrietta Street a-talking. Presently, maybe about 2 or a little after, I thought I would take a look round and see all was right on Brixton Road. It was precious dirty and lonely. Not a soul did I meet all the way down, though a cab or two went past me. I was a-strolling down, thinking between ourselves how uncommon handy a 4 gin hot would be, when suddenly the glint of a light caught my eye in the window of that same house. Now, I knew that them 2 houses in Lauriston Gardens was empty, on account of him that owes them, who won't have the drains seen to, though the very last tenant who lived in one of them died of typhoid fever. I was knocked on the heat, therefore, at seeing a light in the window. I suspected something was wrong. When I got to the door—" "You stopped, and then walked back to the garden gate," my companion interrupted. "What did you do that for?" Rance gave a violent jump, and stared at Sherlock Holmes with the utmost amazement upon his features. "Why, that's true, sir," he said. "Though how you come to know it, heaven only knows. You see, when I got up to the door, it was so still and so lonesome that I thought I'd be none the worse with someone with me. I ain't afeard of anything on this side of the grave, but I thought that maybe it was him that died of the typhoid inspecting the drains what killed him. The thought gave me a kind of turn, and I walked back to the gate to see if I could see Murcher's lantern, but there wasn't no sign of him nor of anyone else." "There was no one in the street?" "Not a living soul, sir, nor so much as a dog. Then I pulled myself together and went back and pushed the door open. All was quiet inside, so I went into the room where the light was a-burning. There was a candle flickering on the mantelpiece, a red wax one, and by its light I saw—" "Yes, I know all that you saw. You walked round the room several times, and you knelt down by the body, and then you walked through and tried the kitchen door, and then—" John Rance sprang to his feet with a frightened face and suspicion in his eyes. "Where was you hid to see all that?" he cried. "It seems to me that you know a deal more than you should." Holmes laughed and threw his card across the table to the constable. "Don't get arresting me for the murder," he said. "I'm one of the hounds and not the wolf. Mr. Gregson or Mr. Lestrade will answer for that. Go on, though. What did you do next?" Rance resumed his seat, without, however, losing his mystified expression. "I went back to the gate and sounded my whistle. That brought Murcher and 2 more to the spot." "Was the street empty then?" "Well, it was as far as anybody that could be of any good goes." "What do you mean?" The constable's features broadened into a grin. "I've seen many a drunk chap in my time," he said, "but never anyone so crying drunk as that cove. He was at the gate when I came out, a-leaning up again the railing, a-singing at the pitch of his lungs about Columbine's newfangled banner or some such stuff. He couldn't stand for his help." "What sort of man was he?" asked Sherlock Holmes. John Rance appeared to be somewhat irritated at this digression. "He was an uncommon drunk sort of man," he said. "He'd have found hisself in the station if we hadn't been so took up." "His face, his dress, didn't you notice them?" Holmes broke in impatiently. "I should think I did notice them, seeing that I had a problem up, me and Murcher between us. He was a long chap with the red face and the lower part muffled round." "That will do," cried Holmes. "What became of him?" "We'd enough to do without looking after him," the policeman said in an aggrieved voice. "I'll wager he found his way home all right." "How was he dressed?" "A brown overcoat." "Had he a whip in his hand?" "A whip? No." He must have left it behind, muttered my companion. You didn't happen to see or hear a cab after that? No. There's a half-sovereign for you, my companion said, standing up and taking his hat. I am afraid, Rance, that you will never rise in the force. That head of yours should be for use as well as ornament. You might have gained your sergeant's stripes last night. The man whom you held in your hands is the man who holds the clues of this mystery, and whom we are seeking. There is no use of arguing about it now. I tell you that it is so. Come along, Doctor. We started off for the cab together, leaving our informant incredulous, but obviously uncomfortable. The blundering fool, Holmes said bitterly as we drove back to our lodgings. Just to think of his having such an incomparable bit of good luck, and not taking advantage of it. I'm rather in the dark still. It is true that the description of this man tallies with your idea of the second party in the mystery, but why should he come back to the house after leaving it? That is not the way of criminals. The ring, man. The ring. That was what he came back for. If we have no other way of catching him, we can always bait our line with a ring. I shall have him, Doctor. I'll lay you 2 to 1 that I have him. I must thank you for it all. I might not have gone but for you, and so have missed the finest study I ever came across. A study in Scarlet, eh? Why shouldn't we use a little art jargon? There's the scarlet thread of murder running through the colourless skin of life, and our duty is to unravel it, and to isolate it, and to expose every inch of it. And now for lunch, and then for Norma Neruda. Her attack and her bowing are splendid. What's that little thing of Chopin's she plays so magnificently? Leaning back in the cab, this amateur bloodhound caroled away like a lark, while I meditated upon the many-sidedness of the human mind. Alright, well that wraps it up for this week. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Really appreciate your support, and tell somebody about the podcast this week. Just spread the word. If you're enjoying a free, high-quality audiobook and you know somebody who also might enjoy it, why not share it with them? I think you could really make their day, and if you make their day, you'll make my day too. So, double days made just like that. Boom. Yeah, okay. We'll catch you next week. Stay tuned. There will be more coming at you. Yeah.